I want to thank everybody who is here today, and I'm going to introduce the people behind me. We have Elliot Payne, who is the president of the Minneapolis City Council, Guadalupe Lopez, the executive director of Violence Free Minnesota, Emily Hutchinson, vice president of global programs for the Center for Victims of Torture, Sarahi Mateo, assistant director of family advocacy for Esperanza United, Mubina Qureshi, co-executive director of Asian Indian Family Wellness, Andrea Kittleson, program manager of the International Institute of Minnesota, Amirthani Keefe, executive director of the Domestic Abuse Project, and Sei Yang, executive director of Transforming Generations. We are holding this press conference today to urge the Senate to vote against the Laken Riley Act. Our hearts break for all those who loved Laken Riley, a nursing student who was jogging in Athens, Georgia, when she was kidnapped and murdered. I can't imagine what her loved ones are going through right now. In a rational world, we would honor her memory by focusing on preventing serious violence. We would do that by, among other things, putting more resources into holding those charged with sexual assault and murder accountable. This bill does not do that. We would invest in serious intervention programs that prevent harm before it happens, like getting guns off our streets and providing trauma support for gunshot victims. This bill does not do that. We would invest in better treatment programs or targeted interventions in areas where we know serious violence occurs. This bill doesn't do that either. Instead, politicians are weaponizing this tragedy for political reasons by focusing on the mandatory detention and deportation of people arrested for shoplifting, theft, or burglary. If this bill becomes law, people will face mandatory detention and deportation for merely the allegation of misdemeanor shoplifting or a similarly low-level offense. There is no due process of law. There is no requirement that there be an actual conviction. This bill preys on a popular lie that non-citizens are the drivers of crime in their communities. Immigrants, both documented and undocumented, commit crimes at substantially lower rates than citizens. This bill does nothing to protect public safety and will cause serious harm. Here's why. We already have a mechanism to deport people who are convicted of a very broad swath of conduct, including the same conduct targeted in this bill. This bill goes so much further, requiring deportation when a non-citizen is merely arrested for a low-level offense. And I use the term non-citizen specifically rather than undocumented person because this bill targets all non-citizens, from those who are unauthorized to dreamers who arrived in this country as children, to legal permanent residents who have called Minnesota home for decades. This bill would require the detention of children who might shoplift a candy bar. It requires the detention of a parent who might shoplift diapers because she can't afford them for her infant. And we know that the president-elect has a history of separating children from families and detaining them in abusive facilities. This bill would inevitably make it more difficult for us at the county attorney's office to prosecute serious cases because non-citizens will be terrified to come forward and report crimes when they are the victim or testify in court about witnessing a crime. Thousands of non-citizens have been witnesses in serious criminal cases prosecuted by the Hennepin County Attorney's Office, and that demonstrates the threat to public safety stemming from a bill that would scare people away from cooperating with law enforcement. Additionally, the bill means that non-citizen witnesses who have a pending minor charge would be detained and deported, making it much more difficult for us to prosecute serious cases. This bill could also lead to more violence in our communities. If a person commits a crime against a non-citizen, all the person would have to do is threaten to go to the police first and accuse the victim of theft. That would be enough to have ICE detain them and eventually deport the non-citizen, and the person who caused the harm would go scot-free. In the same way, our criminalization of sex workers for decades has allowed people to physically harm sex workers without recourse. This bill would make non-citizens targets of crime. Finally, we are living in a time where many feel free to unleash extraordinary xenophobia against non-citizens. We see it every day on social media, on the streets, and we hear it from some politicians. This bill opens the floodgates for people to channel that hate and make false allegations against non-citizens to get them detained and deported. If any non-citizen is falsely accused of theft, they would be detained and then could be deported before ever having a chance to prove their innocence. This scenario is not far-fetched. We already see false allegations happen. Those who cause harm and want to shield themselves from the consequences can use threat of false charges to exploit and intimidate non-citizens. Most people really don't understand how the system works, and all a person needs to do is threaten an allegation. This includes domestic partners, employers, and traffickers. That's not public safety. That's simply cruelty. And people will see this bill for what it is and have no faith that our legal system works for everyone. There is still time to stop this bill from passing. I call on the Senate to vote against it. Please call your senator and tell them you stand for public safety, and that means voting against this bill. And regardless of the outcome of this bill, I want to be clear to our community. Our office is committed to protecting vulnerable communities, including our undocumented neighbors. If people make false claims against undocumented individuals, they will be prosecuted. If people cause harm to undocumented individuals, they will be prosecuted. We will do everything that we can to protect our community members, and we will fight back against this unnecessarily, deeply cynical, and harmful bill. As we hold this press conference today, one of our assistant county attorneys, Eder Castillo, is at the southern border in McAllen, Texas, using personal time to volunteer at a humanitarian refuge for migrants. Eder knows firsthand the public safety impact of making non-citizen victims, and witnesses comfortable in contacting law enforcement and assisting our office with prosecutions. At this time, I'd ask Elliot Payne, the president of our city council, to step forward.
My name is Elliot Payne. I use he, him pronouns, and I'm the president of Minneapolis City Council. And the danger of a bill like this is very profound at the local level. Local government does not see our constituents as citizens or non-citizens. We see everybody as a part of our community. And a bill like this is going to have a cooling effect, not just in the criminal justice system around false allegations against victims. It's going to have a cooling effect for anybody, depending on their immigration status, on interacting with government. That means seeking out worker protections when they're getting wage theft. That means renter protections when their landlord is, their building's not up to code. It's gonna have a cooling effect for our community to come to government to seek assistance when there are protections in place for them. And this is gonna have a profound effect around the unintended consequences. And frankly, the intended consequences of this feels to me to be that the cruelty is the point, which is where some of the political energy is coming from in specifically targeting this vulnerable community. And we have a community that is consistently exploited by these bad actors. And local government exists to protect people from those exploitations. But a law like this is just going to be bad law. It's going to cool people from reaching out to their local representatives like me, who are out here to advocate for them. And we really need to ask our senators to vote this bill down.
Next, we have Guadalupe Lopez, Executive Director of Violence Free Minnesota.
Bonjour, my relatives, Jean Obaneshikwe, Indigenous Cause, Mangandondam. My name is Guadalupe Lopez. I'm Executive Director of Violence Free Minnesota, statewide domestic violence coalition to end relationship abuse here in Minnesota, where we have 90-plus member programs serving our communities, trying to end and keep our communities safe from domestic violence. Violence Free Minnesota unequivocally condemns the creation of the approval of the Laken Riley Act, although our hearts and prayers go out to the family and the community members who have felt the pain and the loss of her, of her presence in the community. But such bills as this do not promote public safety, nor do they decrease violence against women. Instead, they perpetuate normalization of homophobic hatred and lay the groundwork for additional legislators that targets, surveils, and punishes and enacts violence against immigrant communities and communities of color. Yet research indicates that undocumented immigrants are even less likely to commit crimes of violence than individuals born of the United States. Such legislation is based on hateful stereotypes that would lead to any meaningful reduction of violence against women. Legislation such as the Laken Riley Act not only generates racist or xenophobic fear-mongering, it stands in stark contrast to widespread apathy across public safety systems, elected officials, and public responses of crisis of missing, murdered, and Indigenous women and missing, murdered Black women and girls. Ending violence against women and promoting public safety requires transformation of a culture that normalizes and condones such violence. Bills such as the Laken Riley Act will never achieve this transformation, and if acted, it will instead cause untold devastation and harm to communities already facing disproportionate surveillance and punishment. Thank you.
Next, we have Mobina Qureshi, the co-executive director of Asian Indian Family Wellness.
Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. This is Mubina Qureshi. I use she and they pronouns, and I'm executive co-director at SEWA AIFW, Asian Indian Family Wellness. We are the only nonprofit organization serving global South Asian diaspora, mainly serving immigrant and refugee communities. And we have already been struggling with the disparities which exist in the systems when it comes to the victims and survivors of intersectional victimization, whether it's domestic violence or the crime on the street. And this act will further dehumanize all the people of color, especially immigrant and refugee families who are already struggling. It's just so unlawful to think of deporting someone who's shoplifting, and the cost is around $100. I was reading the details, and it's just horrible to see how our systems are working towards making something like this a deportable crime. I have been working with victim survivors of gender-based violence since long, and I have seen LGBTQ plus identifying, especially trans people, going through a lot. They are way more likely to get dehumanized and get punished under the law for being under like illegal or whatever crime they do. And I feel this is going to further make our communities feel more vulnerable, as well as scared for their life, especially immigrant and refugee families. I think that's all I have to say, that I urge all the lawmakers, all policy folks to stop this and not get it passed. Thank you.
Next, we have Andrea Kittleson, Program Director of the International Institute of Minnesota. Sorry about that. Emerthany Keith, Executive Director of the Domestic Abuse Project.
So my name's Amadini Keefe, and I serve as the Executive Director at the Domestic Abuse Project, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing advocacy, case management, and mental health therapy to victims and child witnesses of domestic violence, as well as individuals with a history of perpetrating violence. Recently, we've observed an increase in the number of women who are survivors of domestic violence and have ended up in the criminal justice system themselves, often as a result of responding to violence in their own relationships. Given our expertise in advocacy and mental health, I'd like to draw attention to a relevant quote from Judith Herman, a noted researcher and trauma practitioner. "No intervention that takes power away from the survivor can possibly foster her recovery, no matter how much it appears to be in her immediate best interest." The Laken-Riley Act, while designed with the aim of protecting women, unfortunately has indirect but significant repercussions for domestic violence victims, particularly those who are non-citizens or undocumented. The legislation will most certainly heighten the fear of reporting abuse among undocumented survivors, increase their vulnerability, lead to underreporting of crimes, and most concerningly, contribute to the criminalization of survivors who are already experiencing violence. We recognize that victims of domestic violence may be coerced into committing minor criminal acts, such as theft or property damage, at the behest of their abusive partners. Survivors often express that threats to their immigration status or complications related to their asylum process emerge when they seek to escape or reach out for support. Furthermore, under this legislation, domestic violence victims may face criminal charges for minor thefts, and risk deportation when they report incidents of domestic violence. All of this reflects a troubling dynamic where the minor crime could be prioritized over the more serious issue of domestic violence. In some cases, partners may retaliate by accusing victims of petty crimes, with the potential of having their victim deported to evade accountability for their own violent actions. Economic barriers present one of the greatest challenges for individuals attempting to leave abusive situations. Many victims find themselves turning to their abusive relationships due to difficulties in securing housing, childcare, and transportation after enduring financial abuse and isolation. Survivors often must rebuild their lives with limited resources, including few belongings and no savings. When faced with the choice of purchasing essential items like diapers or risking deportation, while seeking assistance to connect with resources, we must ask ourselves how this legislation truly empowers victims and serves the best interests of women. Lastly, we're already in a time frame where police, community resources, and domestic violence resources are limited. The strain that this legislation will put on both community and system resources to support and advocate for victims that may need immigration, legal, and mental health support when domestic violence is on the rise is unjust. The message that this sends to us as a society is that domestic violence continues to be undervalued as an issue worth addressing, and there is a risk of it being valued at just under $100. I urge legislators to not approve this act.
Emily Hutchinson, the Vice President of Global Programs for the Center of Victims of Torture.
Good morning. My name is Emily Hutchinson. I'm the Vice President of Global Programs at the Center for Victims of Torture, and we join Hennepin County Attorney Mary Moriarty and the agencies present here today who provide services every day to vulnerable individuals living in Minnesota. At CVT, we extend care to asylum seekers and refugees who are victims of torture, and we hear every day about the difficulties they face while trying to rebuild their lives and begin healing from the trauma they have endured. We oppose the Laken-Riley bill because it would harm torture survivors and their communities in ways that will directly impact their healing. At CVT, we have spent 40 years providing rehabilitative care to people who were tortured by governments where due process does not exist. People are detained for inconsequential or sometimes entirely made up reasons because they spoke out against autocratic governments and then were subjected to indefinite detention. We see every day the profound harms that indefinite detention causes, both psychologically and physically. This bill threatens to impose those harms on people accused but not convicted of a petty crime. Our clients are afraid. When they hear news about this kind of legislation, the memory of past torture is awakened and parlays into current fear and halts healing. We are further concerned that this bill will empower racial profiling and that abusers could use it as a threat to keep victims from reporting domestic violence. For example, an abuser could threaten to falsely report their spouse has committed a theft. Victims deserve legislation that empowers them to heal, rebuild their lives, and seek justice without fear of further trauma or retribution. The Laken Riley bill, however, would do the opposite. It forces survivors into a position where they would have to navigate an even more complex and harmful legal system, where their voices are silenced and their rights are diminished.
Say Yang, Executive Director of Transforming Generations.
Good afternoon. My name is Say. I'm the Executive Director of Transforming Generations. Our organization focuses on working with victims, survivors of gender-based violence, as well as working with harm doers, working to learn new skills instead of using violence. I'm here today to urge our leaders, our representatives, and stakeholders to consider the unintended consequences an act like Laken Riley Act would have on immigrant survivors of violence. This act, as it currently stands, exposes victim survivors of sexual violence and domestic violence to even more danger and distress, rather than offering them the support they need. It subjects to an additional risk. This is an issue we cannot simply overlook. As an organization that works with victims of abusive international marriages, we've seen the exploitation that many have faced due to vulnerabilities as immigrants being controlled by their partners. Firstly, it is a well-known tactic of power and control that harm doers may force survivors to commit criminal acts under the threat of serious violence or threats of getting the survivor deported. When used this way, any of the following may occur. The harm doer may hold this fact over the victim's head as a way to continue to control them, should she engage in the criminal act. It also puts her at risk of being trafficked. This is also a tactic used in marriage abandonment, knowing that the survivor will be deported. This is something we see in abusive international marriages. It also does not give the immigrant survivor an opportunity to fair custody if a minor is involved, and is another tactic harm doers use to avoid accountability for child support. The deportation of an immigrant survivor may also result in serious violence or death should she be sent back to her family in her home country, where protections for survivors may not exist and where shame and saving face is still practiced. Immigrant survivors of violence will less likely to reach out for help from authorities for fair retaliatory accusations that could result in detention, as mentioned previously. Immigrant survivors sometimes serve as key witnesses to higher level crimes, but if impacted by this bill, prosecutors risk losing access to these key witnesses. Mandatory detention provisions of the bill will be harmful in practice, as it does not provide a recourse for wrongfully convicted immigrant survivors, no due process for fair trial, and could encourage the profiling of people believed to be undocumented strictly based on the color of their skin and their accent. Lastly, I end with this thought. When someone has caused harm, they should be held accountable here in the U.S., where the victim of crime can have their due process for justice through our systems, healing and closure if needed. Detaining and deporting someone who has caused harm takes away the opportunity for the victim of crime to seek justice, and it isn't going to keep a victim of crime safe. What's going to keep them safe is the web of support in the community that provides the safety and security they seek and need. Every person deserves to feel safe and secure, especially those who have already endured hardship. We must seek alternative solutions and ensure no one is left behind and one type of victim is not privileged over another, and that we don't perpetuate the very injustices we aim to eliminate. Thank you.
Thank you. Questions?
Yeah, I'm curious, more specifically, if this were to pass, how your office would handle theft-related cases involving undocumented. Oh, thank you. Involving folks who are immigrants who are undocumented. More specifically, wondering how you would balance enforcement of this act with protection of due process rights for those individuals.
So our office prosecutes felonies across Hennepin County. So we wouldn't see those kinds of cases. They would go to the city attorney in the city in which they were alleged to have happened. We are responsible for youth or juveniles, and so, but we typically get the cases after an arrest or a citation. So if this bill passes as is, it is going to make it extremely difficult because the law right now does mandate mandatory detention for a child who is arrested or charged, which could be interpreted as being a citation, which would be up to police. And there isn't anything that we can do about that. So that's part of the tragic consequence of this. I wanted to say, so Say was talking about accountability and the fact that victims should be able to have that accountability. We have in the past had people charged with serious crimes deported before we've had an opportunity to prosecute them. And sometimes that means incapacitation in prison, but that has happened, and that will continue to happen if we don't, or if a person who's accused of a serious crime or charged with a serious crime ends up in detention. They may get deported without us ever being able to hold them accountability and without the victim ever being able to be in court and talk about what the harm meant to them. So that is also a consequence of this.
Adam Webster with WCCO
Yes.
Television. Adjacent question. Obviously, we have a new federal administration coming in less than a week. Who's made it very clear that immigration is a priority. Minnesota, not a sanctuary state, but I know Hennepin and Ramsey County consider themselves sanctuary counties. Curious what that means for your office and its approach, and how will you kind of interact with decisions being made at a federal level? Say the federal government's asking you to do something, will you comply, or is it something where you say, this is kind of how we do things here?
Well, the federal government doesn't have a lot of control over what we do locally. That's just the way the systems work. There's separation of powers between the federal government and local government. For our office, we are always concerned and focused on public safety. That is our goal here. We have certified what are called UNT visas. Those are provide some status for victims, immigrants who are victims of crime, so that they can help us prosecute wage theft, trafficking, all of those kinds of things. We have been certifying those cases, certifying UNT visas since I've been in office. We will continue to do that. Also, when I came into office, people in the office were not allowed to consider any collateral consequences as a result of a conviction, including immigration. We have been in the process for a while of developing a new policy there that allows our lawyers to look at collateral consequences, including immigration, but always looking at it from a public safety lens. There are ways, and we have a lot of discretion in terms of how we charge, what kind of resolutions we offer. And if it is consistent with public safety, we will try to navigate that in a way that doesn't allow an immigrant to be deported. I mean, there are situations, and we see this all the time, where somebody is accused of a felony, maybe not a very serious felony, and they have perhaps American-born children. Should we try to figure out how to keep that parent in the country so that they can be a parent to their kids? Or should we just blindly, make sure or not look into that so that they are deported and their American-born children are left here without a parent? So those are the kinds of situations we are looking at and will continue to look at through this administration and beyond.
Do you have any idea if the law enforcement agencies you work with have any of that same discretion available to them if a law
Yeah, we have something like 38 law enforcement agencies in Hennepin County. Law enforcement always has discretion. They have great discretion into whether they arrest somebody or give them a ticket, or whether they don't arrest somebody and maybe just refer for diversion. So law enforcement has a lot of discretion. And I imagine it will be up to the individual police chiefs, their city councils, their mayors, as to what kind of policies they have or develop, and how much they allow them to use their discretion.
Sorry, if I may just follow up on
Sure.
the previous thing that you had said to, in response to the first question. Just prepping for next week and beyond. There's estimates nearly 100,000, 90,000 undocumented folks living in the state of Minnesota, many of them right here in Hennepin County. We're hearing people talking about a lot of nervousness, making plans, but really not sure what to anticipate for what's to come, right? What would your message be to someone who might be, undocumented, but living in Hennepin County? What would you want them to know, headed into this next week? So I think a lot of people are really nervous about what's to come.
I would say to them, I understand they're scared. They have reason to be, but in terms of our office, we will continue to provide the same protections we have. I can guarantee them if they are the victims of crime, we will do whatever we can to hold the person responsible. We will continue to certify UNT visas. We will look at immigration status. So we are in Hennepin County, we are in Minnesota, and we have certain values here. We value our immigrant neighbors. We understand they bring so much enrichment to our communities. We understand that, we respect that, and we want to do what we can to keep our immigrant neighbors safe and in our community.
Let's say it passes, what additional resources do you anticipate your office might need to essentially comply with the act?
So we don't, so one thing about this bill right now is it's unfunded. And as many of you know, our Hennepin County Jail is very full. It's over capacity. In fact, the Department of Corrections has mandated that the jail reduce the jail population to about 600. So many of the people who are held pre-trial here in Hennepin are in other counties. I have absolutely no idea where people would be held, but they would be held by ICE, not by us. So this isn't something that we are required, there's really nothing for us to do here in terms of even helping the federal government enforce this. That is something that they have to figure out. I'm saying in our role, my role as Hennepin County Attorney, we value our immigrants and we are going to do what we can within the confines of public safety to be able to protect our immigrant neighbors. Thank you.